Hello everyone, welcome back to the course Strategic Management Accounting. This is topic 2, which I titled as Reconceptualizing Competition, Discourses of Competitive Advantage and Strategic Positioning. The primary focus of this particular topic is the manner in which Michael E. Porter's contributions, or Porterian Discourses of Strategy, reconceptualized the notions of competition and strategy. However, before we move on to that focal attention point, we should first understand how the notions of competition and strategy were conceptualized before Michael E. Porter's contributions. Therefore, we will discuss how classical models of business policy and corporate planning conceptualized the notion of competition and strategy. In an overall sense, this topic is organized around 3 interrelated learning objectives. The first one is to explore and understand the manner in which classical frameworks of business policy and corporate planning conceptualized the notions of competition and strategies. Secondly, we will explore how Porterian discourses of strategy reconceptualized the notions of competition and strategies. Thirdly, we will discuss how these reconceptualizations implicated in strategic management accounting or accounting calculations and rationalizations. So this topic is organized around these 3 key learning objectives. And this topic is delivered in 2 lectures. In this lecture, we will mainly concentrate on the first element, the manner in which classical models of business policy and corporate planning conceptualized the notion of competition and strategy. In the next lecture, we will concentrate on the Porterian reconceptualizations and how they implicated in strategic management accounting. The emergence of modern form of management and also management accounting can be attributed to 2 institutional apparatuses. First is the factory, and the second is the corporation. It is these 2 elements, the factory and the corporation, which provided the institutional basis upon which modern form of management and accounting was invented. During the Industrial Revolution, production started to be organized in factories. Factories became the prominent domain or a site or the mode of production. And the corporations became the prominent or the dominating institutional form which own and organize and manage the factories. So taken together, factories and the corporations provided the institutional basis upon which the modern form of management came into being. During the Industrial Revolution and even after that, at the early phase of modern management, the primary focus was on the labor process, systematization and rationalization of the labor process. What I mean by the labor process is the set of relations into which a worker or a laborer has to enter when she or he carries out a particular productive activity. And this labor process involves the relationships that a worker has to maintain with the machines and the tools that he or she has to use in carrying out a given productive activity. The labor process also involves relationships that this worker or the laborer has to maintain with his or her co-workers. And the labor process also includes relations that he or she has to maintain with his or her superiors and managers. So it is these relationships with which a particular good or service is produced. It is these relationships within which a surplus value is created. So, in the early phase of modern management, the focal attention was the rationalization and systematization of this labor process. Industrial engineers such as Frederick W. Taylor made a huge, significant contribution in this rationalization and systematization of the labor process. The attention was on the division of the work, division of the labor, scheduling of the work, planning of the work, delegation of the work, and monitoring and measurement of the work, as well as designing appropriate reward or payment structures to motivate the worker in that setting of manufacturing, in the setting of the factory. So that is what the modern management included in that early phase. And Ford's assembly line further systematized, further enhanced this scientific management with the invention of assembly line. That's what we call Fordism. So in this scientific management and in this Fordist regime of manufacturing and management, the notion of strategy was absent. The notion of strategy was silent. There were no strategy gurus. There were no strategic plans. There were no strategic implementations. There were no consultants. The notion of strategy was, by and large, absent. They were not an explicit element to be dealt by the managers. Strategy was only implicit to the extent that point of production and the factory is a site in which strategies can be enabled and enacted. Strategy was only implicit. In that sense, strategy was basically to enhance the efficiency with which labor carries out the productive function, the efficiency with which labor can be synchronized with the machine. And that understanding of improving the production, that understanding of enhancing the profitability and the productivity and so on, was only implicit. Not any explicit discussions about strategy. So that is the status of the notion of strategy at that particular point. So to summarize and to repeat, at the early phase of management, especially during the Industrial Revolution, the competition was not taken as a serious issue. Instead, the issue was to enhance the efficiency with which the labor carry out the productive functions, the efficiency with which the labor is synchronized with the machine. Therefore, the focal attention was on the systematization and rationalization of the labor process. Strategy was not explicit, only implicit, to the extent that implicitly the strategy was to enhance the productive efficiency of the labor, to gain the economies of scale. Corporations started to rapidly expand by having new factories across the countries, by launching into new markets, new regions, by introducing new product lines. For that purposes, corporations started to acquire other firms, merge with other firms. Mergers and acquisitions became a common managerial trend. Since the beginning of the 20th century and 1960s, there were three major mergers and acquisition waves in the US economy itself. As business historians like Alfred Chandler explains very well, by 1960s, large majority of larger corporations in the US, through mergers and acquisitions, have grown into what we now call M-form organizations or multi-divisional organizations, or conglomerate corporations. So as the corporations evolved into these multi-divisional firms, as the corporations grew larger and larger, the managerial attention started to shift from the factory floor to the management of the corporation as a totality. Management of the corporation as a totality became more crucial issue than the management of the factory floor. Therefore, corporate managers started to become more critical than the industrial engineers and the scientific managers and the production managers. Corporate planning or the corporate strategy started to emerge in this context of managing the corporation as a totality, in the context of multi-divisional forms. A multi-divisional enterprise is a firm with quasi-independent divisions dealing with its own competitive conditions. This diagram illustrates a multi-divisional organizational form. So in a multi-divisional organizational setting, you would have two or more quasi-independent divisions, which we now call strategic business units or SBUs in the contemporary strategic management textbooks. Each of these divisions or SBUs would have its own market to cater, its own competitors, its own customers, and its own suppliers. And each of these business divisions would have its own core functions managed by the division itself. It would have its own factories, its own purchasing department, its own marketing and sales department, finance and accounting, and so on. So these business units are rather decentralized, independent business entities running on its own as an individual business. A multidivisional enterprise would have two or more such divisions. And to coordinate, to consolidate, to manage all these divisions, there would have a corporate head office, a general office. And this general office responsibility is to oversee, to monitor, to coordinate, and to consolidate all these divisions into a total singular organization, the corporation. So managing this totality, managing this corporation became a critical challenge. And the corporate planning, corporate strategy started to emerge from this context. So in 1960s, we see quite a few corporate planning books, corporate strategy books came to being. For example, Iga Ansoff's book on corporate strategy, Alfred Chandler's book on strategy and structure. So this is the period in which the corporate strategy or corporate planning started to emerge as a unique discipline, as a separate discipline. So in this context, the corporate strategy or the corporate planning or business policy is to be understood as the particular function carried out by or set of functions carried out by the corporate head office. So it involves basically handling three key managerial challenges. The first one is the coordination among those quasi-independent, decentralized business divisions or the SBUs. Coordination and consolidation of these decentralized entities. That is the first challenge the corporate head office or the corporate planners or the corporate strategist would have to deal with. And the second challenge is the challenge or the problem of the environment. Dealing with legal, governmental, political, socio-cultural and economic constraints. So these corporations have to deal with various regional, political, legal conditions and so on. So they have to formulate various kind of corporate policies to handle various environmental issues, environmental pressures, including political, legal, cultural, social, and economic conditions. And thirdly, this corporate office had to deal with the necessity of further diversification. How can firm, as a corporate entity, grow further and further by having further diversification? So these are the three key managerial challenges or issues that the corporate head office had to deal with. And majority of, or almost all, corporate planning models or strategic planning models, business policy models emerge to address either one or more of these issues. So we will discuss how each of these issues resulted in the creation of a set of corporate planning or corporate strategy models and frameworks. Now, let us talk about the first challenge that the corporate managers had to deal with. How can they coordinate and consolidate these independently operating business divisions or the SBUs? There are three key means or elements through which that can be achieved. The first one is the long-term goal setting. Long-term goals operated as a means through which this consolidation and this integration and this coordination is achieved. Corporate managers would set a set of long-term objectives for the corporation as a whole. And these long-term objectives for the corporation may be spelled out as corporate objectives, vision statements, and mission statements, and so on. And then a specific set of objectives would be derived from these long-term corporate objectives for each and every individual business division or SBU. Therefore, corporate managers impose a set of objectives for the divisional managers. They have to achieve those objectives. And those objectives work as an integrative mechanism. So those objectives will spell out the specific manner in which the division would contribute to the long-term objective of the corporate body. So the divisions were to be understood as a specific element of this total corporate entity. So the long-term objectives or the objective setting or goal setting is the first mean through which this corporate integration, coordination, and the consolidation is achieved. And the second means through which this is achieved is the corporate policies or the business policies. In response to the specific set of legal, political, cultural, social, and technological challenges that the corporation would face in a particular time, the corporate managers would set a set of corporate policies, corporate procedures, corporate plans, and so on, which have to be followed, which have to be adopted by the independent business divisions. So each and every business division would have a set of corporate policies, corporate procedures to follow. And they would operate as a mechanism through which this integration, this consolidation is achieved. And thirdly, allocation and reallocation of resources among these business divisions would help the corporate managers to create this consolidation and the integration and the coordination. It is through that each and every individual business division would operate as an independent business. It would create its own profits. However, profits created by these independent business divisions are ultimately owned and managed by the corporate head office. They would be consolidated into the corporate funds. They would be brought into a large corporate investment fund, which is in the hands of the corporate managers, and they have the power and autonomy and authority to reallocate that funds among these business divisions. So they would decide which SBU would receive further funding for expansion and which SBU should be divested, and so on. So that is the third element through which the integration and the consolidation and the control of individual business entities are achieved by the corporate managers. So three specific means through which the coordination, consolidation is to be achieved. Long-term goal setting, corporate policy setting, and the allocation and reallocation of resources. This quotation from Alfred Chandler's classic book, Strategy and Structure, vividly explains how these three elements are understood to be the constitutive element of corporate planning. Accounting played a significant role in this coordination and consolidation in two specific ways. Firstly, accounting provided the necessary calculative basis upon which these independent business entities can be assessed, monitored, compared, and managed. Specifically, consolidated financial statements played a significant role here. The individual accounts created by these independent business divisions were ultimately consolidated into a single set of accounts, which provided detailed information about how each and every individual business entity contributed to the overall profitability of the corporate entity, and how the corporate funds were created by the amalgamation of all these individual business entities. So that is the accounting's first contribution. Consolidated financial statements as the basis upon which these independently operating business entities are monitored, measured, assessed, compared, and managed. Then, perhaps more importantly, the three key elements we discussed earlier: setting of long-term goals, business policies or corporate policies, as well as allocation and reallocation of resources, were largely driven by, based upon one singular accounting calculation: return on investment or return on equity. The return on investment was the ultimate criteria upon which corporate managers were to decide which SBU should be reinvested or not. And the return on investment played a critical role in setting long-term objectives for these individual business entities, as well as corporate plans and procedures and policies. So as a result, a return on investment has to be calculated for each and every individual business entity. So in terms of responsibility accounting, these individual business divisions were considered not as simply cost centers, income centers, or revenue centers, or profit centers, but as investment centers. Given their status as an investment center, the return on investment was the criteria to be applied. Therefore, the ultimate outcomes of these individual business divisions are to be assessed in terms of their return on investment. So, return on investment has to be clearly understood. For that purpose, for example, DuPont Corporation came out with their ratio analysis framework, which we now call DuPont System of Analysis, which is illustrated in this diagram. So they decompose the return on investment into a number of key elements so that they can understand why a particular division, particular business unit is either performing very well or not performing very well in terms of their return on investment. So that is the second contribution that accounting made towards corporate planning. So to repeat and summarize, accounting made a significant contribution to corporate planning in two ways. First is the provision of consolidated financial statement. Second is the calculation of return on investment, which then decomposed into its various elements through the DuPont system of ratio analysis. Allocation and reallocation of resources is perhaps the most challenging activity that the corporate managers had to deal with. Therefore, for that purpose, there emerged various corporate planning models or frameworks. Classic examples include BCG Growth Share Matrix, or the Boston Consultancy Group Growth Share Matrix, and the GE 9-cell matrix. These are collectively called portfolio planning models. These portfolio planning models assessed individual business divisions or SBUs in two dimensions. The first dimension is the relative strength of the business, whether that particular business division is a weak one or a stronger one in relative terms. Whether that particular business is a good guy or a weak guy in relative terms. And the second dimension is the attractiveness of the market or the industry in which that particular business is operating. Whether that particular business is in an attractive place or not. Very often, this is assessed by the growth potential of the industry or the market. So these are the two dimensions. The attractiveness of the place in which the business is operating and the relative strength of the business. Now, when it comes to the BCG matrix, Boston Consultancy Group matrix, strength of the business is assessed by a single indicator. That indicator is the relative market share, which is calculated by dividing your own business market share by the best competitor's market share. So if you are the leading business in this particular market, if you are the one with the largest market share in this particular market, so your relative market share is more than 1, indicating that you are the leader. On the other hand, if you are not the leading guy in this particular market, your relative market share should be less than 1. So you would have a map or region where you can say, in the case of or in terms of relative market share, either weak or strong. And then the Boston Consultancy Group matrix assesses the attractiveness of the place, attractiveness of the market in which you operate in terms of the market growth rate. So yet again, you can see there should be a particular markets which are very highly growing. And there may be some other markets whose growth rate is very, very low. So you have high growing markets and the low growing market. Now GE 9-cell index basically extended, further refined this BCG matrix by expanding these dimensions. For the General Electric, assessing the relative strength of their individual business entities only on the basis of relative market share was not sufficient. Therefore, they incorporated a number of indicators and created what they call a composite index. Still, with this composite index, what do they measure? They still measure the strength, relative strength of the particular business division. Whether that particular business division is a weak guy or a stronger guy. And similarly, when it comes to the attractiveness of the industry or the market, rather than totally relying upon the market growth rate, they yet again created a composite index by incorporating multiple indicators. So therefore, their assessment of the relative strength as well as the attractiveness of the market is more advanced, more complicated. But yet, still, what do they measure? They still measure the attractiveness of the place in which the firm operates. To summarize, all these portfolio matrices, one way or the other, assess the relative strength of the business division and the attractiveness of the place in which or the market in which they operate. So you would have a map like this, either 2x2 map or a 3x3 map or 9-cell map. Instead of high and low, you can have high, medium and low, so you get 3x3 matrix. But still, the basic logic, the basic mode of assessment is the same. Complication is different. Once you create this particular map, then you locate your businesses on that map. So you could have a business, a weak business in the wrong place, a relatively weak business in saturated, non-growing market or dying market. Or you can have a very strong firm, strong division, strong product in a highly growing market segment. Superb. So like that, what you do? You locate your businesses, individual businesses on this particular map. And then you may label them as a what? Cash cow, a question mark, a dog, a star. So if you have a weak guy in a weak place, you would call it a dog. So that business is a dog. So you have to get rid of it, divest. So by locating these individual business entities on this particular map, the corporate managers can decide which business should receive our attention, our care, our support. So this guy is the good guy in a good place, having the wonderful growth potential, a star. So we have to grow him into a cash cow. So we will put more money onto him. And this guy is a bad guy in a bad place. Get rid of him, divest as much as possible. Reduce the cost as much as possible. Take the money off as much as possible. Divest. And this guy is a question mark, just started, not yet sure. Be selective, assess further before you make a decision. A cash cow, generating a lot of money, but in a very saturated market. Penetrate and as much as possible milk it. So you would use various kind of rhetoric like shoot the dog, milk the cow, invest or brighten the star, and so on. So those are the consultancy rhetoric based upon which these resource allocation decisions are made. So in brief, the portfolio planning models creates a map, strategic map, on which individual business units would be located in order to decide whether that individual business is a strong guy or a weak guy, whether that individual business is in an attractive place or an unattractive place. Then accordingly make decisions. Two fundamental decisions: invest or divest, allocate or do not allocate money, take off. So that's how corporate planners made their decisions on the basis of these portfolio planning models. So the portfolio planning models became very popular technique in corporate planning, especially during 1980s and 70s. Now, having discussed how corporate planners addressed the issue of coordinating and consolidating independently operating business divisions or SBUs, now we need to turn into the second challenge that the corporate planners faced. So that is the problem of the environment. During 1960s and 1970s, corporate managers, consultants, strategy gurus, and various management writers started to reconceptualize the environment as the bigger supra-system in which organizations operate as subsystems. So, in order to make sure the growth and the survival of these subsystems, organizations need to serve its environment. So therefore, for example, strategy guru Iga Ansoff started to call corporations or the organizations as environment serving organizations. In this context, corporate planning or corporate strategy is considered to be creating and maintaining a strategic fit between the external dynamics of the environment on the one hand and the internal dynamics of the organization on the other hand. Creating and maintaining this connection, this alignment between the external environment and the internal environment is considered to be one of the key activities of the corporate planners or the corporate strategist. For example, this quotation from Iga Ansoff very vividly reveals this understanding of corporate planning or corporate strategizing. Now, to create this alignment, to maintain this alignment between internal dynamics of the organization and the external dynamics of the environment, management gurus and consultants and the managers created a set of analytical tools, rationalization tools. The most common and popular in relation to this environmental alignment is what we call SWOT analysis, SWOT analysis, or in other words, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat analysis. According to this framework, the environment has to be analyzed in terms of two dynamics, opportunities and threats. So you analyze and understand the environment either as possible opportunities or possible threats. Then the internal environment, internal factors of the organization need to be analyzed either as strength or weaknesses. then the corporate planning or the strategic planning is simply to match these strengths and weaknesses with the opportunities and threats in the environment. So the opportunities need to be capitalized while mitigating the possible threats with the appropriate use of our strength while addressing our weaknesses. So the appropriate use of strength while addressing our weaknesses in order to capitalize environmental opportunities while mitigating the possible threats is strategizing according to this perspective of corporate planning or strategic management. Then in order to further facilitate this alignment, strategic managers would use some more analytical frameworks, especially to analyze the wider environmental context. One of the most popular is what we call PEST analysis: political, economic, social, and technological conditions analysis. So according to this particular framework, in order to decide our strategies, in order to decide our corporate objectives, in order to decide the way we would allocate our resources among our SBUs, we would analyze the wider environmental conditions in terms of the political conditions, economic conditions, sociological conditions or social conditions, and the technological conditions that the business is facing. Then later on, this PEST framework was further extended into what they call PESTAL analysis: political, economic, social, technological, environmental or ecological, and legal. So these are the very popular rationalization techniques according to which the strategic activity of making an alignment, creating a strategic fit between the external environment and the internal environment is achieved. So that is the second challenge that the corporate planners faced, the problem of environment. Then we have the problem of diversification. While addressing the issue of coordinating and consolidating independently operating business divisions, and while addressing the issue of creating and maintaining a strategic alignment between the external environmental dynamics and the internal environmental factors, corporate managers also had to deal with the problem of diversification. The diversification problem is the challenge of further enhancing continuous expansion of corporate activities into new products, new markets, and so on. The diversification has always been one of the critical challenges of corporate management, and it will always be one of the critical challenges of corporate management even in the future. So, in order to facilitate this corporate function of diversification, various analytical or rationalization models came out. One of the most discussed, popular model in this respect is the framework proposed by strategy guru Iger Ansoff. Ansoff's matrix or Ansoff's product market matrix. Ansoff conceptualized the possibilities of diversification in two dimensions. The first one is the market and second one is the product. A firm can diversify. A corporation can diversify its activities in two directions. Either by inventing and reinventing new products or by developing, moving into new markets. So accordingly, you would be thinking about going to new products in the same markets or going to new products in new markets and so on. So you have, as this diagram illustrates, 4 specific strategies to follow. The least risky is what Ansoff call market penetration. That is, you are trying to penetrate further in the existing market with the existing products. So you are not taking the risk of developing a new product. And you are not taking the risk of moving into a new market. Instead, you are going to be in the same market with the same product. But you are thinking about whether there are any more possibilities to enhance our sales, to enhance our profitability, and to enhance our return on investment. So you would be thinking about new pricing techniques, new advertisement campaigns, new sales and promotion campaigns, new cost management campaigns, new techniques of reducing the cost and then improving your profitability and return on investment. So that is what Iger and Ansoff call market penetration strategy. The least risky strategy to follow. And second one is the market development. So you have a set of product or services with the same product line, you would move into a new market. So that is what Iger and Ansoff call market development, finding new markets for the existing products. It is a bit more riskier than the market penetration. And the next one is product development, which is a bit more riskier than even market development. Because the product development, new product development would involve a lot of investments. Research and development, product designing, production, distribution, and so on. But that is one possibility. So you will develop a new product for the existing market. So you will be in the same market, you will be serving the same market but with new products. And you are thinking about the possibility of enhancing your profitability, sales, and return on investment with a new set of products but in existing markets. And then finally, the most risky but perhaps most rewarding strategy is diversification. So you would go into new markets with a new product. So that will involve all the cost associated with the development of the new market, moving into a new market, as well as all the cost associated with the development of a new product. Therefore, it demands huge investments and therefore it is very risky. So this is what Iger and Ansoff presented as the possibilities of diversification. So this provides a particular rationalization framework through which the problem of diversification, further expansion of the business activities can be analyzed and understood. And this has been very popular during 1970s, 60s and so on. And even now people use this somewhat in certain occasions. And then together with this diversification matrix, One can even use a very popular technique, what we call product life cycle concept. So according to the product life cycle concept, every product as well as every market would have a life cycle. So there will be a development stage, introduction stage, growth stage, saturation stage, and then the decline. So the strategies would be decided, strategies would be thought about according to the stage in which a particular product or the market is currently in. So the further expansion, investment, divestment decisions are to be made on the basis of the particular life cycle stage of the product, service, or the market. So these are two very popular rationalization techniques according to which the problem of diversification was understood and analyzed. Our discussion so far concentrated on how various concepts, frameworks, and notions of corporate planning and corporate strategy evolved since 1960s. And you would understand the frameworks and the concepts that we discussed so far are by and large rational frameworks. Then in 1980s and in 1990s, there emerged a new thinking. The managerial attention or the focal attention of strategy analysis started to shift from corporate planning to strategy implementation. Managers, consultants, and the strategy gurus started to understand that strategy implementation is perhaps the most challenging activity than strategic planning. So they needed to understand how and why certain strategies become successful while others become unsuccessful. Then the attention was paid on to various behavioral, cultural, institutional, and structural factors that either hinder or facilitate the strategy implementation. Various notions such as strategic vision, strategic mission, strategic leadership, strategic thinking, change management, continuous improvement, total quality management, quality circles, and so on became very popular among corporate managers. Various strategy gurus started to write on these issues. Books such as In Search of Excellence by Peters and Waterman and The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge became popular textbooks among the corporate managers. So in a broader sense, strategy implementation became one of the most critical issues to be addressed by corporate managers. Then, to facilitate this change management or this strategy implementation process or this continuous improvement and so on, various frameworks were introduced. One of the prominent and most discussed framework regarding this is the McKinsey's 7S framework, which I illustrated here. So as you understand, the McKinsey's 7S framework tries to capture various cultural, behavioral, institutional, and structural dynamics into one framework. So what is important is not specifically to understand how and why in each of these individual factors operate, but rather to understand the overall logic. So during this particular period, corporate planners' attention moved on to the problem of implementation. So for that end, the behavioral, cultural, institutional and structural factors were to be considered. So in that sense, strategizing involves analyzing and understanding these sort of behavioral, cultural, institutional and structural factors, and creating a system in which all these factors would coexist nicely. So for example, for 7S framework, excellence, which is for Peters and Waterman the essence of strategy making. So for Peters and Waterman, in their book In Search of Excellence, basically try to articulate the understanding that strategizing means seeking the excellence. So when a company is trying to seek excellence, in their analysis, for example, these 7 key factors should be there. An excellent firm would incorporate these behavioral, cultural, institutional, and structural elements. So therefore, strategizing means making sure that these conditions prevail within the organization. So that is how the behavioral school reconceptualized strategizing. Now, with that discussion on how behavioral, cultural, institutional, and structural considerations were incorporated into corporate planning or corporate strategy implementation, we have reached the end of this lecture. So to summarize, the overall aim of this particular lecture was to explore and understand the manner in which classical models of corporate planning or corporate strategy conceptualized the notions of strategy and competition. So we started with a discussion on the very early phase of management, so-called scientific management and Fordism. So during that particular period, we discussed the attention was mainly on the management of the labor process. The key objective of management was to synchronize the labor with the machine so that the economies of scale can be achieved. And through that economies of scale, through that synchronization of labor with the machine, the profitability of the firm can be maximized. Then, since the beginning of the 20th century, I mentioned that the firms started to grow further through mergers and acquisitions, through new product development, market development, and so on. And they evolved into what we call multi-divisional firms. So by 1960s, large majority of big corporations became multi-divisional firms. And we discussed it is in this particular context of multi-divisional firm or multi-divisional enterprises, the notion of corporate planning started to emerge. And the managerial attention was shifted from the labor process to the management of the corporation as a totality. So within this context of multi-divisional firms, corporate managers faced 3 strategic issues. First one is the coordination and consolidation of independent business divisions. Second one is the problem of the environment, the alignment of the internal environmental factors with the external environmental dynamics. And the third one is the problem of diversification. Then we discussed how various conceptual models analytical frameworks came out to address these specific issues. So, various conceptual frameworks and models that we often see in strategic management textbooks should be understood and explained in relation to these three key issues. And then finally, we discussed how these strategic management discussions were further expanded by incorporating behavioral, cultural, institutional, and structural factors. So that is what we discussed in this particular lecture. So, thank you very much for watching this, and see you later again in the next lecture.